Welcome, weary traveler, to the echoes of the fallen realm, where epic tales become lullabies for the soul. Tonight, we drift across the moonlit waters of the great sea, following brave sailors as they sail toward destiny in the Second War of Azeroth. Close your eyes and let the peaceful sounds of wind and wave guide you into dreams of distant shores. Long ago, when the world was younger and the stars sang different songs, there was a time of great change upon the lands of Azeroth. This is a tale whispered by the wind through ancient oaks, carried by the tide to distant shores, remembered by those who walk in dreams. In the mist-shrouded waters of the great sea, where moonlight dances upon gentle waves like scattered pearls, there sailed ships that carried the weight of destiny. The Alliance fleet, proud vessels of white oak and iron, moved through the darkness like phantoms of hope, their passage marking the water with trails of phosphorescent foam that glowed like liquid, starlight in their wake. The night sky stretched above them like a vast cathedral of stars, each point of light a candle lit in memory of those who had sailed these waters before. The constellation of the Navigator's Crown hung low on the horizon, its ancient pattern unchanged since the first sailors had learned to read the heavens. Beneath this celestial dome, the ships moved in perfect formation, their hulls cutting through water that reflected the starlight like scattered diamonds upon dark velvet, creating a pathway between the earthly realm and the infinite mystery above. Admiral Dalen Proudmoore stood upon the deck of his flagship, the magnificent Quel'Thalas Pride, watching the horizon with eyes that had seen countless dawns upon these waters. The sea breeze stirred his weathered coat, and in the distance, storm clouds gathered like ancient prophecies written in shades of silver and gray. He was a man shaped by salt and sorrow, his heart as deep as the ocean itself, carrying the memories of every sailor lost beneath these waves, every ship that had vanished into the hungry darkness of the deep. The admiral's hands, scarred by rope and weather, gripped the polished rail of his ship with the unconscious familiarity of decades spent at sea. Each line on his weathered face told a story of storms weathered, of battles fought against both nature and men, of homecomings both joyful and tragic. His beard, once golden like the wheat fields of his homeland, had turned silver with the passage of years and the weight of command. Yet his eyes remained clear and bright, reflecting the wisdom that comes only to those who have spent their lives reading the moods of wind and water, learning the ancient language that the sea speaks to those who truly listen. The night was peaceful, almost dreamlike in its serenity, with only the gentle lapping of water against the hull and the soft creaking of timber that had been blessed by master shipwrights and consecrated by priests. The sound was rhythmic, hypnotic, like a lullaby sung by the sea itself to comfort those who had entrusted their lives to her mercy. Stars reflected in the dark water like fallen tears of the gods, creating a path of light that seemed to lead towards some distant, unknowable shore where all earthly troubles would be resolved in the fullness of time. Above them, the sails billowed white as clouds against the star-filled sky, great sheets of canvas that had been woven by the finest craftsmen in the Alliance lands and blessed by priests who understood the sacred nature of the marriage between wind and sea. The canvas caught the wind with a soft whisper, a sound as familiar as breathing to these men of the sea. Each sail was a masterwork of craftsmanship, woven from the finest fibers and blessed with prayers for fair winds and safe passage. The rigging sang in the breeze, a musical harmony of rope and wind that spoke of journeys taken and journeys yet to come, of the eternal dance between human ambition and the forces of nature that both challenged and sustained it. Behind him, the crew moved with quiet purpose through the ship's many levels. These men of the tide who had been born to the rhythm of wind and wave, shaped by generations of maritime tradition that stretched back to the very dawn of civilization. They spoke in hushed voices, their words carried away by the ocean breeze before they could disturb the profound peace of the night. Some mended nets with careful stitches, their needles flashing in the lamplight like tiny silver fish as they worked to repair the tools of their trade. Others tended to the rigging, checking each line and knot with the meticulous care of those whose lives depended on such details, for in the unforgiving environment of the sea, the smallest oversight could lead to disaster. The night wrapped around them like a gentle shroud, peaceful yet pregnant with possibility, filled with the sense of impending change that marks all great moments in history. The air smelled of salt and kelp, of distant rain, and the green scent of coastal meadows, where families slept in peaceful ignorance of the drama unfolding upon the waters. Somewhere in the darkness, a nightbird called across the water, its cry lonely and beautiful, a sound that seemed to echo the melancholy that touched every sailor's heart when far from home, that bittersweet mixture of adventure and longing that drove men to seek their fortunes upon the endless sea. In the captain's quarters below, maps were spread across a heavy oak table that had been crafted from the heartwood of trees that had grown for centuries before giving their lives to this noble purpose. The charts showed every reef and current, every safe harbor and dangerous shoal within 1,000 leagues. These accumulated knowledge of countless navigators who had risked their lives to map these treacherous waters. Their edges were worn smooth by countless consultations, testament to the vital importance of the knowledge they contained. Candles flickered softly in their brass holders, casting dancing shadows across the detailed drawings of distant coastlines, their warm light creating an atmosphere of scholarly contemplation in the midst of preparation for war. The admiral's cabin smelled of sea salt and old leather, of ink and parchment and the distant memory of home, that complex bouquet that marked the private quarters of a man who had spent his life balanced between the demands of duty and the pull of domesticity. Here, in this sanctuary of wood and brass, plans were made that would shape the fate of kingdoms, decisions reached that would echo through the corridors of history for generations yet unborn. The walls of the cabin were lined with books, their leather bindings darkened by years and salt air, a personal library that revealed the depth of learning that separated a true naval commander from a mere ship's captain. Volumes of naval strategy sat beside collections of sea shanties, treatises on weather patterns next to personal journals filled with observations of wind and tide. A chronometer ticked quietly in its brass case, marking the passage of time with mechanical precision that seemed almost miraculous to men accustomed to judging hours by the position of the sun and stars. On the desk, beside the charts, lay a compass whose needle pointed steadily north, a constant in a world of constant change, a reminder that even in the midst of uncertainty, some truths remained fixed and unshakable. The alliance had been forged in desperation, born from the ashes of fallen Stormwind, nurtured by the wisdom of kings who understood that unity was their only hope against the coming darkness that threatened to engulf all the free peoples of the world. King Tyrrhenus of Lordaeron, wise and weathered by the burdens of rulership, had seen the signs in the smoke of distant fires, in the reports of refugees who spoke of horrors beyond imagination. His scouts had brought tales of burning villages and ravaged farmlands, of families fleeing before an enemy unlike any the world had seen, creatures whose very existence challenged every assumption about the natural order of things. Lord Anduin Lothar, the last knight of Stormwind, had carried the tale of his kingdom's fall like a sacred burden, his words painting pictures of green-skinned warriors and fell fire that consumed everything in its path. In the great halls of Capital City, where marble columns reached toward vaulted ceilings painted with scenes of ancient victories, his voice had echoed through chambers that had witnessed the signing of trade agreements and marriage contracts, but never before had they heard such desperate words. The fall of Stormwind had shaken them all, for if that mighty kingdom could fall, what hope did any of them have standing alone against the tide of destruction that was even now gathering on the horizon? But here, upon the gentle swells of the great sea, such earthly concerns seemed distant, transformed by the alchemy of moonlight and salt spray into something approaching poetry. The water was a world unto itself, where time moved differently, where the urgent became patient, where even war must bow to the rhythm of the tides that had pulsed since the world's beginning. The ships moved through the night, like prayer beads on a cosmic rosary, each vessel a meditation on hope and sacrifice, a floating cathedral dedicated to the proposition that some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for if necessary. The sea had its own laws, older than any kingdom, more enduring than any treaty, eternal principles that governed the interaction between human ambition and the forces of nature. Here man was humbled before forces greater than himself, reminded of his place in the vast scheme of creation, taught the wisdom that comes only from confronting one's own mortality in the face of the infinite. The ocean was both mother and executioner, capable of infinite tenderness and unimaginable cruelty, a teacher whose lessons were written in salt water and carved in the bones of those who dared to challenge her dominion. Young Turalian, paladin of the Silver Hand, stood at the bow of one of the escort vessels, his armor gleaming softly in the starlight like captured moonbeams transformed into steel. The plate mail had been forged in the sacred armories of Cathedral Square, each piece blessed by the Archbishop himself, and inscribed with prayers for protection that had been written in the ancient tongue of the light. He was still new to command, still learning to carry the weight of other men's lives upon his shoulders, still discovering the terrible burden that came with the power to make decisions that would determine who lived and who died in the crucible of battle. The light burned within him, a warm presence that pushed back against the darkness, both within and without, but even divine radiance could not banish the uncertainty that gnawed at his heart like a persistent ache. His warhammer hung at his side, its head inscribed with runes that glowed faintly with inner fire, a weapon that had been a gift from his mentor, Uther the Lightbringer, passed down through generations of paladins who had wielded it in defense of the innocent. The handle was worn smooth by the hands of heroes, and sometimes, in quiet moments like this, Turalion felt he could hear the whispered prayers of those who had carried it before him, their voices joining in an eternal chorus of dedication to the cause of righteousness. The young paladin's thoughts drifted to his training in the halls of the Silver Hand, where he had learned to channel the light's power in service of justice. He remembered the long hours spent in meditation, the careful study of sacred texts that spoke of duty and sacrifice, the gradual understanding that true strength came not from the sword, but from the faith that guided it. His teachers had spoken of the burden of leadership, of the terrible responsibility that came with the power to command other souls in battle, of the way that every decision would be weighed in the balance of eternity. Around him, the ship's crew went about their duties with quiet efficiency. These men whose battles were fought against storm and reef rather than orc and troll, yet who understood duty perhaps better than any warrior. They moved through the rigging like dancers in an aerial ballet, their feet sure on ropes that swayed with the ship's motion, their hands skilled in the thousand tasks that kept a vessel safe and seaworthy. Their faces, weathered by sun and spray, bore the patient expression of those who had learned to read the sea's moods and bend their will to its demands, who understood that the ocean was not an enemy to be conquered, but a partner in an eternal dance of cooperation and respect. Behind them, leagues away across the dark water, the great port of South Shore slumbered, beneath a blanket of sea mist that rose from the warming waters like the breath of sleeping giants. Its docks were empty now, the fishing boats having returned with the evening tide, their hulls heavy with the day's catch, and their crews eager for the warmth of home and hearth. The harbor smelled of fish and tar, of rope and salt, and the thousand odors that marked a working port where honest labor provided sustenance for families and communities. Lanterns flickered in windows like earthbound stars, each one representing a family gathered around warm hearths, unaware that their peaceful world was about to change forever in ways that would echo through generations yet unborn. Children dreamed of adventure while their parents spoke in hushed tones of rumors from the east, of strange ships upon distant waters that moved without sails and carried passengers whose very presence seemed to pollute the air around them. In the taverns of South Shore, old sailors told tales of distant lands and strange encounters, their words growing more fantastical with each mug of ale. But tonight the tale seemed different, touched with an ominous quality that made even the most skeptical listeners shift uneasily in their seats. The lighthouse keeper had reported unusual signals seen far offshore, lights that flashed in patterns unknown to any civilized nation, messages that spoke in a language that no human throat could pronounce. Merchant captains spoke of fishing vessels found empty and adrift, their crews vanished without trace, their nets still full of fish, but their human cargo simply gone as if they had been plucked from the deck by invisible hands. The harbor master had doubled the night watch, though he could not say exactly what he feared might come from the darkness beyond the harbor mouth, what threat might emerge from waters that had known only peace for living memory. The merchant vessels that usually plied these trade routes had grown scarce in recent weeks, their absence creating an economic hardship that was felt throughout the coastal communities. The regular cargo ships from Stormwind had ceased arriving, and no word had come to explain their absence, leaving merchants with empty warehouses and customers with unmet needs. Captains spoke of strange sightings, of ships that moved without sails, powered by rhythmic drum beats that echoed across the water like the heartbeat of some vast sleeping beast that was slowly awakening from dreams of conquest. The sound carried farther than it should have, they said, as if the very air itself was infected with some alien malice that allowed the drums to speak across distances that should have swallowed their voices. Some claimed to have seen green-skinned figures upon those distant decks, creatures that stood upright like men, but possessed a savage aspect that chilled the blood of even the bravest observer. Their eyes glowed red in the darkness. It was whispered and their voices carried an inhuman quality that spoke of lands beyond the reach of civilized thought, of places where different laws held sway and different gods demanded different kinds of worship. But such tales were dismissed by most as sailors' fancies, born of too much rum and too many lonely nights at sea. The kind of stories that grew in the telling until they bore no resemblance to whatever mundane reality had spawned them. The ocean had always been a place of mystery and legend, where the line between truth and imagination became blurred by distance and isolation, where rational men could convince themselves that they had seen mermaids or sea serpents in the spray and foam kicked up by their own passage. Admiral Proudmoore knew better than to dismiss such reports, for his scouts had confirmed what his experienced heart had long suspected. The horde was coming, not by land as many had predicted, but by sea. Their crude vessels carrying an army that sought to claim these peaceful shores for their own dark purposes. Intelligence, gathered by brave men who had sailed close to the enemy formations, spoke of numbers beyond counting, of warriors whose very presence seemed to pollute the air around them, whose ships moved according to principles that violated every law of seamanship known to civilized mariners. The Alliance fleet had positioned itself between the invaders and the coast, a line of wood and steel that would either hold or break upon the tide of war, a barrier of human determination standing between the familiar world of peace and prosperity and the alien nightmare that sought to replace it. Every ship in the formation was precious, representing months of preparation and the combined naval might of the free kingdoms, each vessel a masterwork of human craftsmanship and a repository of accumulated wisdom about the art of war at sea. The flagship alone carried enough firepower to level a small fortress, her cannons loaded with both conventional shot and blessed rounds that had been consecrated by the priests of the light, ammunition that was said to be particularly effective against creatures touched by dark magic. Her crew was handpicked from the finest sailors in the fleet, men whose loyalty was absolute and whose skill was legendary throughout the naval service. Every officer aboard had earned his position through merit rather than birth, and every sailor had volunteered for this dangerous duty, knowing full well the risks involved. But tonight, in this moment of quiet before the storm, there was only peace that seemed to emanate from the very heart of creation itself. The sea cradled their ships like a mother's embrace, and the stars above seemed to whisper of ancient times when the world was whole and unmarked by the scars of conflict. The admiral closed his eyes and listened to the song of the waves, each crest and trough a note in an eternal symphony that had played since the world's beginning and would continue long after all human ambitions had been reduced to dust and memory. The music spoke of cycles within cycles, of tides that flowed regardless of human ambition, of the patient persistence that would outlast all earthly kingdoms and see the rise and fall of civilizations with the same indifferent majesty that marked the passage of seasons. It was a humbling melody, one that reminded mortal men of their place in the larger scheme of things, of the temporary nature of all their hopes and fears and dreams of glory. In the ship's galley, cook fires burned low, their red glow painting the faces of sleeping sailors in shades of amber and gold that transformed even the most weathered features into something approaching art. The night watch moved with practiced quiet, their footsteps muffled by years of experience in the art of moving through a ship without disturbing their sleeping comrades. They knew these waters well, had sailed them in peace and storm, and understood the moods of the sea better than they knew their own hearts. For the ocean had been their home, and their teacher for most of their adult lives. Some hummed old shanties under their breath, melodies passed down through generations of seafaring folk, songs that spoke of home and love, and the eternal longing of those who sought their fortunes upon the wine-dark sea. The music was wordless and haunting, carrying within it the accumulated sorrow and joy of countless voyages, the hopes and fears of men who had chosen to make their lives in the space between sky and water, where the normal rules of earthly existence were suspended in favor of older, more elemental laws. The cook, a weathered man whose beard was white as foam, and whose hands bore the scars of decades spent feeding hungry sailors, prepared a simple meal for those on watch with the same care that he would have devoted to a feast for royalty. His hands moved with unconscious skill, chopping vegetables and stirring pots while his mind wandered to thoughts of the home he had left behind. Many years ago that it seemed almost like a dream from another lifetime. He had sailed with Admiral Proudmoore for 20 years, through calm seas and raging storms, through battles and peaceful trading voyages, and he knew the weight that his commander carried on nights like this. Tonight, he added an extra measure of herbs to the stew, hoping that the familiar taste of home might bring some small comfort to men facing an uncertain dawn, knowing that good food could be a powerful weapon against despair and uncertainty. The wind carried the salt, sweet scent of kelp and brine, mixed with the distant perfume of coastal flowers that bloomed in meadows where children played in blissful ignorance of the drama unfolding upon the waters beyond their sight. Night-blooming jasmine grew wild on the cliffs of South Shore, its fragrance carried by offshore breezes to sweeten the air above the waves, a reminder that beauty persisted even in times of trial and uncertainty. Somewhere in the darkness, dolphins played in the ship's wake, their silver forms cutting through the phosphorescent foam like living moonbeams brought down from the celestial realm to dance upon the surface of the sea. Their joyful cries seemed to mock human concerns with their simple celebration of existence, their pure delight in the physical joy of movement through their natural element. Even these simple creatures seemed to celebrate the coming dawn, their playful leaps a testament to the enduring beauty of the natural world that would continue its eternal dance, regardless of the outcome of human conflicts. Seabirds called to one another across the vast expanse, their cries echoing the loneliness and beauty of the endless ocean that stretched away in all directions until it merged with the star-filled sky at the distant horizon. Albatrosses wheeled overhead on motionless wings, riding the air currents with effortless grace that spoke of millions of years of evolution and adaptation to this harsh, but magnificent environment. These were the ocean's true children, born to live between sky and sea, knowing no master but the wind, and recognizing no law but the ancient rhythms of tide and season. To the sailors, these birds were omens whose meaning had been debated and discussed for as long as men had gone down to the sea in ships. Their presence was generally considered a sign of fair weather and good fortune, while their absence was often interpreted as a warning of storms to come or battles to be fought. Tonight they seemed unusually numerous, their calls more frequent than normal, as if they too sensed the approaching change and sought to bear witness to whatever history was about to be written upon the waters they called home. As the hours passed with the slow majesty of a funeral procession, the fleet maintained its formation with mathematical precision that would have impressed the finest choreographer, each ship a guardian in the night, moving through the water like a school of great fish, guided by some instinctive knowledge of their proper place in the larger pattern. The vessels moved through the water with that peculiar grace that marked ships designed by master craftsmen who understood both the science and the art of naval architecture. Signal lanterns blinked messages between vessels, a maritime language of light that spoke of positions held and duties maintained, of the constant flow of information that kept a fleet functioning as a single organism rather than a collection of individual ships. The flagship led them all, its proud silhouette cutting through the darkness like a prayer made manifest in wood and canvas, a symbol of human determination and ingenuity that would either triumph over the approaching darkness or be consumed by it in the attempt. The signalmen worked with quiet efficiency, their colored lanterns flashing coded messages across the water in patterns that had been developed over centuries of naval cooperation. Each flash conveyed vital information, course corrections, status reports, observations of wind and weather that might affect the fleet's ability to maneuver when the time for action arrived. The language they used was ancient and precise, developed over generations of naval officers who understood that clear communication could mean the difference between victory and disaster in the confusion of battle. Tonight, the messages were routine, reports of readiness, confirmations of position, the mundane but essential chatter that kept a complex organization functioning smoothly. But each man knew that before long, these same signals might carry orders that would determine the fate of nations, commands that would send ships into battle and men to their deaths in service of causes larger than any individual life. Young sailors who had never seen battle stood beside veterans whose scars told stories of past conflicts, their nervous energy a sharp contrast to the calm acceptance of the older men. The veterans spoke quietly of home, of wives and children waiting in distant ports, their voices carrying the deep contentment of those who had found their place in the world and understood the meaning of their sacrifice. They described sunrise over familiar harbors, the taste of their mother's cooking, the sound of church bells ringing across peaceful villages where life continued its normal course in blissful ignorance of the drama unfolding upon distant waters. Their words painted pictures of the world they fought to preserve, the simple pleasures and everyday miracles that gave meaning to their sacrifice. Children's laughter echoing through market squares, lovers walking hand in hand along peaceful shores, old men sitting in tavern corners sharing stories of their youth, while the fire crackled on the hearth and the wind whistled around the eaves of buildings that had sheltered generations of honest folk. The younger ones dreamed of glory and adventure, their imaginations filled with tales of heroic deeds and noble sacrifice that they had absorbed from the songs and stories that celebrated the martial virtues. They saw themselves standing on the deck of a captured enemy vessel, raising the Alliance banner in triumph, while crowds cheered from the shore and bards composed songs about their courage, and their dreams were bright with visions of honor and recognition, of returning home as heroes to be welcomed by grateful communities and proud families. But the sea made equals of them all, reducing every man to his essential nature beneath the vast canopy of stars that looked down with the same indifferent majesty upon peasant and prince, veteran and recruit, the brave and the cowardly alike. Here rank mattered less than competence, and experience counted more than noble birth or family connections. The ocean was a harsh but honest teacher that cared nothing for human pretensions and everything for the practical skills that kept ships afloat and, no, sailors alive. In the medical bay, healers prepared their supplies with the quiet reverence of those who understood The true cost of conflict, the human price that would inevitably be paid for whatever political objectives drove nations to war. Dr. Mallory, the ship's physician, was a man of middle years, whose gentle hands had mended countless wounds over his long career in naval service. He moved among his instruments and potions with the careful precision of a priest conducting a sacred ritual, for he understood that his work was as much about preserving hope as it was about healing flesh. Bandages were rolled with meticulous care, each strip cut to the proper width and length for specific types of wounds that experience had taught him to expect in naval combat. Potions were prepared according to recipes that had been passed down through generations of healers, their ingredients carefully measured and blessed by priests who understood the spiritual as well as the physical dimensions of the healing arts. Surgical instruments gleamed in their cases, cleaned and sharpened to surgical perfection, ready to cut away damaged flesh in order to preserve life. The doctor's assistant, a young woman named Sarah who had joined the expedition despite her father's protests and the social conventions that decreed the sea was no place for her gender, sorted herbs according to their healing properties with the sure touch of one who had spent years studying the medical arts. Her knowledge of medicinal plants was encyclopedic, gleaned from countless hours in the libraries of Stormwind's Cathedral and the practical experience of working in the charity hospitals that served the city's poor. She could identify dozens of healing compounds by scent alone, and her gentle touch had already earned the respect of even the most traditionalist members of the crew, who had initially doubted her qualifications. Her bag contained herbs and potions gathered from the four corners of the Alliance lands, willowbark for pain, feverfew for infection, comfrey for broken bones, and 100 other remedies that represented the accumulated wisdom of healers stretching back to the very dawn of civilization. These men and women knew that their calling was not to judge the rightness of causes or question the wisdom of kings, but to mend what could be mended, to save what could be saved, to preserve life in the midst of destruction. They would work without regard for nationality or race when the wounded were brought to them, for they served a higher law that recognized no distinction between friend and enemy when it came to the sacred duty of healing. The ship's chaplain, Father Marcus, moved among the crew like a benevolent spirit, offering quiet words of comfort and performing small rituals of blessing for any who sought them. His voice was soft as velvet, speaking of hope and redemption, of the light that burns eternal even in the darkest night, and the divine love that embraces all creation, regardless of the sins and failings that mark every human life. He had served aboard ships for most of his adult life, and he understood the special fears that haunted sailors, the terror of drowning far from home, of being lost forever beneath the waves where no proper burial could be given, and no gravestone could mark their passing. Some sailors knelt for his blessing, their heads bowed in silent prayer as they sought whatever comfort and strength that the rituals of faith could provide. Others simply touched their lucky charms and whispered petitions to gods of sea and storm, following older traditions that predated organized religion and spoke to the primitive human need to believe that someone or something watched over those who ventured into the vast unknown. A few carried small icons of Saint Meridius, patron of sailors, whose image was said to protect against shipwreck and drowning, and whose intervention could calm even the wildest storm. The chaplain blessed them all with equal sincerity, regardless of their particular beliefs or the specific traditions they followed, for he understood that in times of trial, the human heart reached out for any source of comfort and strength. His God, he believed, was large enough to embrace all sincere seekers of truth, and his ministry was to offer hope to any who needed it, rather than to debate points of doctrine or condemn those who worshipped in different ways. Below decks, in the cargo holds that represented the practical foundation upon which all grand strategies ultimately rested, supplies were stacked with military precision that would have impressed the most demanding quartermaster. Barrels of fresh water, sealed with wax to prevent contamination, and marked with the date they were filled, stood in neat rows along the bulkheads like sentries guarding the most precious resource on any ship. Casks of salted meat, smoked fish, and preserved vegetables filled the spaces between, while sacks of hardtack and grain were lashed down against the ship's motion with rope and tackle that would hold secure even in the heaviest weather. These were the mundane necessities that kept armies alive, the unglamorous foundation upon which all grand strategies rested. The tons of food and water and medical supplies that had to be transported wherever fighting men went. The mountains of ammunition and spare parts and replacement equipment that modern warfare consumed with voracious appetite. Without these humble supplies, the finest ships and the bravest sailors would be helpless, reduced to floating coffins when their stores ran out and they could no longer function as effective fighting units. But even these practical preparations seemed touched by magic in the ship's dim interior, transformed by the gentle rocking motion and the play of lamplight across the stored goods into something approaching a meditation on abundance and preparation. The hold smelled of tar and timber, of spices and preserved foods, of the thousand scents that marked a well provisioned vessel ready for whatever trials the future might bring. Oil lamps swung gently from the overhead beams, their light casting moving shadows that danced across the stored goods like living things celebrating the human foresight that had made such preparation possible. The ship's carpenter, old Henrik, made his final rounds through the lower decks, checking for signs of strain or damage with a practiced eye of one who had spent his life working with wood and understanding the stresses that ships endured in their endless battle against the sea. His practiced gaze could spot potential problems before they became dangerous, and his skilled hands could craft repairs from the most meager materials using techniques passed down through generations of shipwrights who had learned their trade in the hard school of necessity. He had served aboard ships for 40 years, beginning as a boy apprentice and working his way up through every grade of naval carpentry until he knew every sound that timber could make, every vibration that spoke of trouble ahead. Tonight, all was well. The ship's timbers were sound and strong, her joints tight, her hull ready to face whatever stresses the coming battle might impose. But he remained vigilant, for he knew that in the heat of combat, when enemy shot was tearing through the ship's fabric, his skills might make the difference between staying afloat and going to the bottom. The Alliance banner flew from the mainmast, its proud heraldry snapping softly in the night breeze like a prayer made visible to heaven and earth alike. Lion and eagle, hammer and sword, the symbols of kingdoms united in common cause, representing peoples who had set aside ancient rivalries and historical grievances to stand together against a threat that endangered all of them equally. The banner itself was a masterwork of textile art, embroidered by the finest seamstresses in storm wind and blessed by the highest authorities of both church and state. Its colors remained bright despite exposure to salt spray and sun, a testament to the quality of the materials and the skill of the craftsmen who had created it. But here, suspended between sea and sky in this moment of perfect anticipation, those earthly concerns seemed distant, reduced to their essential truth: the desire to protect what was cherished, to preserve what was beautiful in a world too often marked by ugliness and destruction. The banner fluttered in the breeze like a prayer made visible, a reminder of the values that bound these diverse peoples together in common cause, despite their differences in language and custom and tradition. Each thread in its weave represented a life dedicated to service, a choice to stand against the darkness regardless of the personal cost, a commitment to something larger and more enduring than individual ambition or desire. As dawn approached with the infinite slowness of all great moments in history, the eastern horizon began to show the faintest blush of rose and gold that marked the eternal boundary between night and day. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, as if the night itself was reluctant to surrender its dominion to the harsh realities of daylight. The stars faded one by one like candles being extinguished at the end of a long vigil, giving way to the eternal promise of morning and the hope that each new day brings to the human heart. Somewhere beyond the curve of the world, the sun prepared to rise upon another day, another chance for redemption or tragedy, for triumph or loss, for the playing out of the eternal drama that pits human will against the inexorable forces of fate. The sea reflected the growing light like a mirror made of liquid silver, its surface broken only by the gentle wakes of the ships and the occasional leap of a fish or dolphin celebrating the coming dawn. The water was transformed into a pathway between earth and heaven, a bridge that seemed to lead toward some distant realm where all earthly conflicts would be resolved in the fullness of time. Schools of flying fish burst from the waves in silver cascades, their fins catching the early light as they glided across the water's surface in displays of natural joy that seemed to mock human concerns with their simple celebration of existence. Even these simple creatures appeared to welcome the new day, their graceful flight a testament to the enduring beauty of the natural world that would continue its eternal dance regardless of whatever violence men might visit upon each other. It is the admiral stood upon his deck and watched the sun rise, as he had done thousands of times before in every ocean and sea, where duty had taken him during his long career in naval service. But this dawn felt different, weighted with significance beyond the mere turning of another day, charged with the potential energy of great events about to unfold. The light spread across the water like spilled honey, warm and golden, blessing the fleet with its radiance and transforming each ship from a shadow into a work of art revealed by the morning glow. Each vessel emerged from the darkness like a masterpiece unveiled, their white sails and polished woodwork gleaming in the morning light with an almost supernatural beauty that spoke to the human capacity for creating art even in the instruments of war. The craftsmanship was evident in every line and curve, every joint and fitting, the accumulated wisdom of generations of shipwrights who had devoted their lives to perfecting the marriage of form and function that marked truly great ships. Seabirds wheeled overhead, welcoming the morning with their ancient cries that had echoed across these waters since before the first human had ever dared to venture beyond sight of land. Terns and gulls rode the air currents above the masts, their keen eyes searching the water for signs of fish, while their presence served as a good omen for the sailors below. Their cries seemed to echo the hopes and fears of the men below, a wordless commentary on the eternal drama of human ambition played out against the backdrop of the indifferent but magnificent sea. Their presence was considered a sign of fair weather and good fortune, the sailors believed, for these birds were thought to be messengers from whatever gods or spirits watched over those who made their living from the sea. The absence of seabirds was often interpreted as a warning of storms or other dangers ahead, while their abundance suggested divine favor and the promise of safe passage through whatever trials lay ahead. One by one, the ships of the fleet emerged from the darkness like sleeping giants, awakening to face their destiny, their details becoming clear in the growing light as the sun climbed higher in the eastern sky. White sails and polished wood, brass fittings that gleamed like jewelry in the morning, light flags and pennants that danced in the strengthening breeze like colorful prayers offered to heaven. Each vessel was a masterwork of human craftsmanship, a testament to the marriage of art and function that had carried their people across the world's oceans for countless generations. The flagship, Kultiran Pride, was the crown jewel of the fleet, a ship whose very existence represented the pinnacle of naval architecture and the accumulated wisdom of centuries of shipbuilding tradition. Her hull was carved from the heartwood of ancient oaks, trees that had grown for hundreds of years before giving their lives to this noble purpose. The figurehead at her prow depicted a crowned mermaid holding a trident, her expression both beautiful and fierce, carved by master craftsmen who had captured in wood the eternal mystery of the sea's dual nature as both nurturer and destroyer. Every line of the ship spoke of strength and grace combined, of the perfect balance between power and elegance that marked the finest examples of the shipwright's art. Her masts rose like cathedral spires toward the sky, their rigging a complex web of rope and tackle that allowed her crew to harness the wind's power with mathematical precision. Her cannons were works of art as well as weapons, their bronze barrels decorated with reliefs that told the story of the kingdom's naval victories and inscribed with prayers for accuracy and divine protection. The crew prepared for the day with practiced efficiency, each man moving to his assigned station with the unconscious grace that marked long habit and perfect training. Hammocks were stowed in neat bundles, their canvas clean and properly rolled according to regulations that had been refined over generations of naval service. Decks were swabbed with holy stones that had been blessed by priests, the salt water and sacred ritual combining to purify both wood and spirit in preparation for whatever trials the day might bring. The great cannons were checked and loaded with ceremonial precision, their bronze barrels gleaming in the morning light like instruments of divine judgment, ready to speak with voices of thunder when the moment of truth arrived. Each gun crew worked with the smooth coordination of men who had trained together for months or years, learning to load and aim and fire their weapons with mechanical precision, even under the most adverse conditions. But even these preparations for war were performed with a ritual solemnity that elevated them above mere technical procedures, each task carried out with the reverence due to sacred duty. The gunners handled their charges with the delicate care of priests preparing communion wine, for they understood that each shot must count in the trial to come, that there would be no second chances if they failed in their duty when the moment of testing arrived. These men understood that they were participants in something larger than themselves, actors in a drama that would be remembered long after their names were forgotten, links in a chain of service and sacrifice that stretched back through the generations to the very founding of their civilization. They were the inheritors of a tradition that demanded the highest standards of courage and skill, and they would not fail that legacy if human determination could prevent it. As the sun climbed higher, its warmth beginning to burn away the morning mist that clung to the water surface like the dreams of sleeping gods, the lookouts perched high in their crows' nests began to report movement on the distant horizon. Dark shapes that might have been clouds or might have been something else entirely began to resolve into definite forms as the improving visibility allowed the keen eyes of experienced seamen to penetrate the remaining veils of distance and atmospheric distortion. The horizon, which had been blurred and indistinct in the pre-dawn darkness, sharpened into a clear line that separated sea from sky with mathematical precision. It was then, in that moment, when day finally conquered night completely, that the true nature of those distant shapes became unmistakable to any observer with experience in reading the signs that marked the presence of ships upon the water. The admiral raised his spyglass, a masterwork of brass and crystal that had been crafted by the finest opticians in Ironforge, their dwarven skill in working with metal and glass combining to create an instrument of almost magical precision. He trained the device on those distant forms, adjusting the focus with practiced movements until the details became as clear as if he were standing on the deck of the approaching vessels themselves. What he saw through the lens made his heart grow heavy with the weight of confirmation, for there before him was the sight that his experience and intelligence reports had led him to expect, but which he had still hoped might somehow prove false. The enemy fleet was coming. Just as the scouts had warned, their crude vessels dark against the brightening sky like a spreading stain upon the morning's beauty, a visual metaphor for the way that war corrupted even the most peaceful and beautiful scenes. But there was no panic aboard the Alliance ships, no desperate scrambling or shouted orders that might have marked a force caught unprepared by the enemy's approach. These were professionals, men who had trained for this moment through long years of service and who understood their duties with the absolute clarity that comes from perfect preparation. They moved with calm purpose, each knowing his assigned role, each trusting in his fellows to perform theirs with the same level of skill and dedication. The machinery of war began to turn with quiet efficiency that would have impressed any observer, but even in preparation for battle, there was a kind of peace that marked men who had made their peace with fate and were ready to face whatever trials destiny might have in store for them. They had done everything that human skill and preparation could do. Now it remained only to see whether their efforts would prove sufficient in the crucible of actual combat. The Horde ships were crude things compared to the elegant vessels of the Alliance, built for function rather than beauty, designed by minds that valued efficiency above all other considerations. They moved through the water with the relentless rhythm of drum beats and the stroke of massive oars that spoke of a completely different philosophy of seamanship, one that relied on brute force rather than the subtle marriage of wind and sail that marked civilized naval architecture. Their dark hulls seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, as if they were constructed from some material that drank illumination and gave back only shadow and threat. From their decks came the sound of harsh voices raised in alien chants, words that seemed to pollute the very air through which they traveled, with their suggestions of violence and conquest. The drums that drove their oars beat with hypnotic rhythm that seemed to echo from the very depths of the earth, a sound that spoke of powers and purposes that no civilized mind could fully comprehend. These were ships built for war and war alone, not for exploration or trade or any of the peaceful purposes that had originally driven human beings to venture upon the sea. Their hulls bristled with crude weapons and improvised armor plating that spoke of a culture where might made right and weakness was punished with death. Great catapults squatted on their decks like malevolent spiders, ready to hurl death across the water in forms that civilized warfare had never contemplated. The orcs who crewed these vessels moved with a savage efficiency that spoke of a warrior culture where survival depended on constant readiness for violence. They had crossed an ocean to reach these shores, driven by ambitions and purposes that no human mind could fully understand, motivated by forces that seemed to spring from the darkest depths of the primitive psyche, where civilization's restraints held no power. But even these enemy vessels had their own terrible majesty, their own claim to a kind of dark beauty that came from their complete commitment to their grim purpose. They moved with the inexorable power of a force of nature, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon or earthquakes building in the depths of the earth. Their very ugliness was transformed into something almost sublime by the context of the vast ocean and the magnitude of the events they represented, becoming elements in a larger composition that spoke to the eternal struggle between order and chaos, civilization and barbarism, the light of reason, and the darkness of unchecked passion. The two fleets drew closer across the morning waters, each following the currents of destiny that had brought them to this moment of convergence, this point in time and space, where the future would be decided by courage and skill and perhaps a measure of divine grace. The sun climbed higher, painting the scene in shades of gold and blue and white that would have inspired painters and poets in more peaceful times, transforming the stage for coming violence into a tableau of almost supernatural beauty. Dolphins still played in the foam of the ship's passage, seemingly oblivious to the approaching conflict, or perhaps understanding on some level that their joy and freedom transcended human concerns. In their joyful leaps served as a reminder that nature's dance would continue, regardless of whatever violence men might visit upon each other, that the essential beauty and wonder of creation would endure long after the causes for which these ships sailed had been forgotten by history. Seabirds still called to one another across the vast expanse of water, their voices carrying messages in languages older than human speech, their presence a testament to the endurance of natural cycles that had continued unchanged since before the first intelligent being had ever looked upon the sea with wonder and longing. The sea itself continued its eternal dance of wave and tide, indifferent to the human drama playing out upon its surface, caring only for the ancient patterns that had governed its behavior since the world's beginning. The distance between the opposing forces diminished with each passing moment, measured now in miles that could be counted on the fingers of one hand rather than the leagues that had separated them through the long night of approach. Signal flags flew from the Alliance ships with increased frequency, coordinating the formation that would meet the enemy charge with tactical precision that had been developed through centuries of naval warfare and refined in dozens of conflicts across the world's oceans. Each captain acknowledged his orders with crisp efficiency, the years of training and discipline evident in every response. The chain of command functioning with the smooth precision of a well-oiled machine. The ships began to spread into battle formation, a choreographed dance of war that had been practiced countless times in peaceful harbors, but would now be performed under conditions where mistakes could cost lives and small errors could lead to disaster. Admiral Proudmoore gave his final orders in a voice that carried the authority of years and the weight of absolute responsibility for the lives of every man under his command. His commands were crisp and clear, leaving no room for misunderstanding or hesitation, delivered in the calm tones of a man who had made his peace with whatever fate awaited him and was ready to face the test of battle with dignity and courage. Signal flags were raised to relay his instructions to the other captains scattered across miles of ocean. Cannons were primed with loving care by men who understood that their weapons might be the difference between victory and defeat, and the ships of the Alliance prepared to meet their destiny with a quiet confidence that came from perfect preparation and absolute commitment to their cause. But even in this moment of supreme tension, when every nerve was stretched, taut with anticipation, and every heartbeat with the knowledge that death might be only moments away, there was a kind of peace that seemed to emanate from the very center of the storm. It was the calm that comes from complete commitment to a chosen course of action, the serenity that marks those who have surrendered their personal fate to forces larger than themselves and found freedom in that surrender. The wind picked up as the day advanced, filling the sails with its power and carrying new scents across the water. The clean, salt air of the open ocean mixed with the smoke and foreign odors of the approaching enemy fleet. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay the shores of home, the ports and harbors where loved ones waited for news that might never come, where families continued their daily routines in ignorance of the drama unfolding upon distant waters. Children played in gardens where their father's return was taken for granted. Wives tended households that might soon become monuments to memory, and merchants opened shops in the confident expectation that the normal rhythms of commerce and trade would continue undisturbed. But here now, in this eternal moment before the storm broke upon them all, there was only the dance of wind and wave, the play of light on water, the endless conversation between sea and sky that had continued since the world's beginning and would outlast all human ambitions and desires. Young Turalion felt the light burning brighter within him as the moment of trial approached, the divine power responding to his heightened emotions and filling him with a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. The sacred energy that was his birthright as a paladin seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, reminding him that he fought not just with sword and shield, but with powers drawn from sources beyond the material world. His hammer seemed to pulse with its own inner fire, the sacred runes inscribed upon its head glowing with soft radiance that spoke of blessings granted by the highest authorities of the church. Around him, his fellow paladins prepared their own weapons and armor, each piece of equipment blessed and consecrated for the coming fight, with rituals that bound them to purposes higher than mere victory or survival. They were warriors of the holy light, trained to channel divine power in defense of the innocent and the righteous, and their presence on the battlefield would tip the scales in ways that mere strategy and tactics could not predict. Their prayers rose like incense in the morning air, petitions for strength and wisdom, for the power to protect the helpless and defend the right against those who would impose their will through force and terror. The light answered their calls, blessing their weapons with power that could cleave through the darkest sorcery, and their armor with protection that could turn aside blows that would shatter ordinary steel. They stood ready to serve as the spiritual as well as the physical defenders of their cause, guardians of the flame of civilization that burned in the hearts of all who believed in justice and mercy and the possibility of peace. The wind began to shift, bringing with it the scent of the enemy ships, tar and iron, smoke and something else. Something alien and unsettling that spoke of distant lands and foreign gods whose worship demanded sacrifices that no civilized mind could contemplate. The Alliance sailors wrinkled their noses at the strange smell, but they held their positions with disciplined calm that marked professional fighting men who would not let exotic odors or unfamiliar sights disturb their concentration on the duties at hand. These men had trained for years to reach, or this moment had prepared their minds and bodies for the trial of battle through countless hours of drill and practice and study. They would not fail their comrades or their cause now, when everything they had worked for hung in the balance, and the future of their civilization might depend on their courage and skill in the next few hours. As the fleets closed within range of each other, a strange quiet fell over the water, as if the very elements were holding their breath in anticipation of the violence that was about to be unleashed upon this peaceful scene. Even the seabirds seemed to sense the tension in the air, their cries becoming fewer and more distant as they sought safer skies away from the approaching conflict. The morning wind dropped to a whisper, leaving the sails hanging slack and the banners drooping from their poles like flags of truce in a war where no quarter would be asked or given. It was as if the world itself was pausing on the threshold of a new age, waiting for the storm to break and the pattern of the future to be revealed in the outcome of the battle that was about to begin. In this moment of perfect stillness, with the sun climbing toward its zenith and the two fleets poised like dancers waiting for the music to begin, there was a sense of profound inevitability that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of destiny itself. This confrontation had been building for months, perhaps years, driven by forces larger than any individual will or desire, shaped by the collision of incompatible worldviews that could never coexist in the same space. Now it was about to unfold with all the terrible beauty and tragic necessity that marked the great turning points of history, as natural and unstoppable as the tide itself, but charged with meaning that would resonate through the generations to come. Every man present felt the weight of that responsibility, the knowledge that they were about to participate in events that would be remembered and studied and argued about for centuries after their bones had crumbled to dust. The admiral stood at his post, weathered hands steady on the ship's wheel, eyes fixed on the enemy formation with the intensity of a hawk watching its prey prepare to strike. Around him, his crew waited in disciplined silence for the order that would shatter the morning calm and transform this peaceful scene into something from the depths of nightmare. Gunners stood ready beside their cannons, their movements economical and precise, every motion the product of countless hours of training and preparation. Marines checked their weapons one final time, ensuring that every blade was sharp and every musket properly loaded with the care that comes from understanding that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death when the fighting began. Signalmen prepared to relay commands across the water to the other ships of the fleet, their colored flags and mirrors ready to carry the admiral's will to every corner of the formation with the speed and precision that modern warfare demanded. The ship's officers took their stations with quiet dignity, each man understanding that the next few hours would test everything they had learned about war and leadership and the burden of command. No word was spoken that was not necessary, for they all understood that this was a moment that demanded silence and preparation, a time for checking equipment and steadying nerves rather than conversation or speculation about what was to come. This was the moment between moments, the pause before the symphony begins, the breath before the song that would either celebrate triumph or mourn defeat, but would certainly mark the end of innocence for all who survived to hear its final notes. The sea sparkled in the morning light like scattered jewels, beautiful and serene, and utterly indifferent to the human drama about to unfold upon its surface. Somewhere beyond the horizon, families waited for news that might never come. Children played in streets that might never again echo with their laughter. And ordinary life continued its patient course in blissful ignorance of the fact that its continuation depended entirely on the courage of men sailing ships across morning waters toward a destiny that none of them could predict, but all of them were prepared to face with whatever strength and skill they possessed. The sun reached its zenith, painting the scene in shades of gold and blue and white that transformed even this tableau of approaching violence into something that resembled a work of art, celebrating the beauty and majesty of the natural world. The distance between the fleets closed to mere hundreds of yards, close enough now to see individual figures moving on the enemy decks, close enough to make out the details of their weapons and the expressions on their alien faces. Soon, very soon, the first shots would be fired, the first blood spilled, the first step taken on a path that would lead either to glorious victory or bitter defeat, or perhaps something more complex and ambiguous than either of those simple alternatives. But for now, there was only this perfect moment of tension and possibility, with destiny balanced on the edge of a knife, and the future hanging in the balance like morning mist over calm waters. The Alliance fleet sailed on toward its appointment with history, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of countless souls who believed in the possibility of justice, of peace, of a world where children could grow up without fear, and where the strong would protect the weak rather than prey upon them. Behind them lay the safety of known shores, the harbors and homes that gave meaning to their sacrifice. Ahead lay the uncertain waters, where fate would be decided by courage and skill, and perhaps a touch of divine grace. But in this eternal moment before the storm, there was only the gentle rocking of ships on peaceful seas, the soft whisper of wind in the rigging, and the patient rhythm of wave and tide that had played since the world was young, and would continue long after all their names were forgotten, and their causes had been transformed into legends told around fires on winter nights by people who had never known the terror and beauty of war at sea. And so the tale begins, as all great tales must, with a moment of perfect quiet before the thunder rolls across the water and the ancient patterns of conflict and sacrifice, heroism and loss, triumph and tragedy begin their eternal dance once more upon the stage, where mortal ambition meets divine indifference, and human courage is tested against forces that care nothing for individual hopes and fears, but everything for the larger patterns that shape the destiny of nations and the fate of worlds. The first cannon spoke, its voice rolling across the water like the judgment of gods made manifest in bronze and flame and fury, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the peaceful morning and announce to all creation that the age of innocence was ending. The report echoed across the water like thunder rolling through mountain valleys, bouncing from ship to ship and wave to wave until it seemed that the entire ocean was reverberating with the sound of human conflict made audible. Other cannons followed in a perfectly orchestrated symphony of destruction, their reports following one another with a mathematical precision that marked the finest naval gunnery. The Alliance ships had opened the engagement with a coordinated broadside that spoke eloquently of their superior training and discipline, each gun firing at the precisely calculated moment that would achieve maximum effect while allowing the smoke to clear between volleys. Shot whistled across the narrowing gap between the fleets with a distinctive sound that every veteran sailor knew to fear. The whistle that meant Iron Death was flying through the air in search of targets to destroy. Some projectiles fell short, raising tall splashes of white foam that caught the morning light like liquid crystal before falling back into the sea. Others found their marks with devastating effect, punching through the crude hulls and improvised armor of the enemy vessels with the irresistible force of precisely aimed artillery. The first blood was drawn, the first damage done to ships and crews that had crossed an ocean in pursuit of conquest, and the morning's peace was shattered forever by the harsh realities of war at sea. The beautiful tranquility that had marked the dawn was transformed in an instant into something altogether different, painted with the colors of violence and destruction that would dominate the scene for hours to come. The orc ships responded with their own crude weapons, catapults that hurled stones the size of barrels and flaming projectiles that traced fiery arcs across the morning sky like falling stars bent on destruction rather than wonder. Ballistae shot massive bolts of black iron with enough force to punch through the hull of any ship unlucky enough to be struck. Their aim poor compared to the precision of the Alliance gunners, but their weapons powerful enough to do terrible damage when they found their targets. Their accuracy was hampered by their unfamiliarity with naval warfare and their reliance on weapons designed for land combat rather than the specialized artillery that civilized navies had developed over centuries of warfare at sea. But what they lacked in precision, they made up for in raw, destructive power. Their projectiles capable of smashing through even the strongest fortifications if they managed to hit their intended targets. The morning air, which had been clean and sweet with the scent of salt and sea flowers, now filled with the acrid smoke of gunpowder and the whistle of projectiles flying in both directions. The first notes had been sounded in what promised to be a symphony of destruction that would play until one side or the other could no longer continue the dance of death that had begun with such terrible beauty. But even in the midst of this chaos, there was a strange kind of beauty that spoke to the human capacity for finding meaning and pattern even in the most violent and destructive events. The ships moved through their formations like dancers in an elaborate ballet, their movements governed by laws as old as warfare itself and as precise as any choreography ever devised by human art. Sails caught the wind and threw it back in precisely calculated angles that allowed the ships to maneuver with grace and precision even under fire, while rudders carved paths through water that had known the passage of countless vessels but never before such a concentration of violence and destruction. This was war elevated to the level of art, violence transformed into something approaching poetry by the skill and courage of those who practiced it with such deadly efficiency. The Alliance ships moved with the fluid grace of a school of predatory fish, each vessel responding to signals from the flagship with the instantaneous precision that marked a fleet whose officers had trained together for years and whose crews understood their duties with the clarity that comes from perfect preparation. When the admiral's signal flags commanded a turn to port, every ship in the formation responded as if controlled by a single mind, their movements coordinated with mathematical precision. The enemy fleet, by contrast, moved with the crude power of a force of nature, like a landslide or an avalanche that destroys everything in its path through sheer momentum rather than skill or finesse. Their ships were powered by the rhythmic stroke of massive oars that beat against the water with hypnotic regularity, driven by the savage determination of crews who knew no law but strength and recognized no authority but victory. The drums that coordinated their movements continued to beat with primitive power that seemed to echo from the very depths of the earth. A sound that spoke of forces and purposes that civilized minds could barely comprehend. It was the rhythm of the war dance, the heartbeat of cultures that had known only conflict since their first emergence into consciousness, the musical expression of a worldview that saw existence itself as an endless battle between competing forces. As the battle developed, both fleets began to spread out across several miles of ocean, the individual ships maneuvering for advantage while maintaining their formation integrity as much as possible under the stress of combat. The Alliance vessels used their superior seamanship to good advantage, their captains demonstrating the tactical flexibility that came from years of training in the art of naval warfare. The frigate Windchaser, fastest of the Alliance ships, darted between the enemy vessels like a wasp attacking a bear, her guns firing with deadly precision before she turned away to avoid the cumbersome response of the Orc ships. Captain Sarah Blackwood handled her vessel with the skill of a master musician playing a complex piece, her commands anticipating the enemy's movements and positioning her ship where she could do maximum damage while avoiding the worst of the return fire. The great ship of the line, Sovereign's Pride, engaged the largest of the enemy vessels in a duel of titans that shook both ships with the force of their exchanges. Vice Admiral Terence Kingsbridge stood on his quarterdeck like a statue carved from granite, his voice carrying clearly above the roar of battle as he directed his gunners with the calm precision of a man conducting an orchestra of destruction. The massive battleship Dylan's Triumph, pride of the Quel'Thalas fleet, brought her enormous firepower to bear against a cluster of enemy vessels that had attempted to break through the Alliance line. Her 100 guns spoke in unison, creating a broadside that could be heard for miles and sending clouds of smoke rolling across the water like fog made of gunpowder and flame. Throughout the engagement, the hospital ship Mercy's Call moved carefully through the battle zone, her white hull and red crosses marking her neutral status as she collected the wounded from both sides. Dr. Eleanor Whitehaven and her staff worked tirelessly in the ship's medical bay, their skills tested to the limit as they struggled to save lives in conditions that would have challenged surgeons working in the finest hospitals on land. The battle raged for hours under the climbing sun, the two fleets locked in a deadly embrace that would determine the fate of kingdoms and the future of entire peoples. The morning that had begun with such peaceful beauty was transformed into something from the depths of nightmare, painted with the colors of smoke and flame and echoing with the sounds of destruction and human agony. Yet even in the midst of this chaos, individual acts of heroism and nobility shone like stars in the darkness. Young Timothy, the powder boy, continued to carry charges to the guns, even after a splinter from an enemy shot had torn open his shoulder, his duty to his shipmates outweighing his concern for his own safety. Brother Marcus moved among the wounded with words of comfort and final prayers, his presence bringing peace to men facing their last moments far from home and family. The ship's cook, old Samuel, turned his galley into an aid station when the medical bay overflowed with casualties, using his knowledge of herbs and basic medical care to help where he could. The carpenter Henrik worked frantically to repair battle damage while the fighting raged around him, his tools singing as he patched holes and reinforced weakened timbers. On the enemy ships, similar scenes of courage and dedication played out in different contexts, but with the same fundamental human themes. Orc warriors fought with savage determination for causes they believed in with religious fervor, their loyalty to their chieftains and their clans driving them to acts of bravery that would have been admirable if directed toward more worthy goals. The battle began to turn in favor of the Alliance, as their superior training and equipment told against the raw courage of their enemies. The coordinated fire of their artillery began to take a devastating toll on the crude orc vessels, while their superior seamanship allowed them to avoid much of the enemy's return fire. One by one, the dark ships began to fall out of formation, their hulls holed below the waterline, or their crews depleted beyond the point where they could continue to fight effectively. But the orcs did not yield easily, fighting with desperate courage even as their ships began to sink around them. Some leaped into the water and attempted to swim to Alliance vessels, hoping to continue the fight hand to hand on enemy decks. Others remained at their posts until the very end, manning their weapons until the sea claimed them and their ships in final embrace. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, the outcome of the battle became clear to all observers. The Alliance fleet had won a decisive victory, but the cost had been high in ships and lives on both sides. The beautiful morning had been transformed into something altogether different, a scene of devastation that would haunt the memories of all who survived to witness it. The surviving orc ships began to retreat, their drums beating a different rhythm now, not the confident cadence of advance, but the somber measure of withdrawal and defeat. They had come seeking conquest, but found only destruction. Their dreams of easy victory shattered on the skills and courage of the Alliance defenders. Admiral Proudmoore stood on his quarterdeck and watched them go, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what this victory had cost and what it meant for the future. This battle was won, but the war was far from over. The enemy would return, probably in greater numbers and with better preparation, and the Alliance would need to be ready to face them again when that day came. But for now, there was the immediate task of caring for the wounded and salvaging what could be salvaged from the wreckage that littered the battlefield. The sea, which had witnessed so much violence and destruction in the past few hours, began its eternal work of healing, washing away the evidence of human conflict with the same patient persistence that had marked its nature since the world's beginning. The morning mist began to rise again from the warming water, soft veils of vapor that gradually obscured the scene of battle and transformed it once again into something approaching peace. The seabirds, which had fled during the worst of the fighting, began to return to their feeding grounds, their cries echoing across water that would soon show little evidence of the violence that had recently disturbed its surface. Young Turalian, his armor stained with smoke and blood, but his spirit unbroken, stood at the bow of his ship and watched the mist begin to swallow the fleeing enemy vessels. The light still burned within him, perhaps even brighter now that it had been tested in the crucible of battle and proven true. Around him, his fellow paladins tended to the wounded and offered prayers for the souls of the dead, their ministry continuing even after the fighting had ended. the Alliance fleet began the slow work of regrouping and assessing their losses, counting the cost of victory in terms of ships and lives, and preparing for whatever challenges the future might bring. Messages were passed between vessels, reports compiled, and plans made for the continuation of their mission now that this first obstacle had been overcome. But all of these practical concerns seemed somehow distant and unreal compared to the profound change that had taken place in the hearts and minds of all who had participated in this engagement. They had looked into the face of war and seen both its terrible beauty and its awful cost, had learned something about themselves and their world that could never be unlearned or forgotten. The sun continued its climb toward the zenith, painting the scene with light that gradually burned away the smoke and mist and revealed the true extent of what had taken place during those violent hours. The water was littered with debris, broken masts and torn sails, empty barrels and scattered equipment, the flotsam and jetsam of battle that would gradually sink or be carried away by the currents. But gradually, inevitably, the sea began to reclaim its peaceful character, the eternal rhythms of wave and tide asserting their dominance over the temporary disruption of human conflict. The morning's beauty, which had seemed destroyed forever by the violence of battle, began to reassert itself as nature's capacity for renewal made itself manifest once again. The dolphins returned to play in the wakes of the ships, their joy undiminished by the violence they had witnessed, their presence a reminder that life and beauty would endure long after the causes of this day's fighting had been forgotten by history. The seabirds resumed their eternal search for food, their cries once again providing a musical accompaniment to the eternal conversation between sea and sky. And in the medical bays of the Alliance ships, the work of healing continued with quiet dedication. Doctors and nurses applying their skills to mend what war had broken, to preserve life in the aftermath of destruction, to offer hope to those who had faced the abyss and somehow survived to tell their stories to future generations who would struggle to understand the price that had been paid for their freedom and safety. The battle was over, but its consequences would echo through the years to come, shaping the destiny of nations and the lives of countless individuals who would never know the names of those who had fought and died on this distant patch of ocean. The victory had been won, but at a cost that would be counted not just in ships and lives, but in the innocence that could never be recovered, the peace of mind that had been shattered by the knowledge of what civilized beings could do to each other when the restraints of law and custom were stripped away by the necessities of war. The scene continues to fade slowly, like mist dissolving before the warming sun, carrying the listener gently toward peaceful dreams of distant seas and the eternal hope that even in the darkest times, beauty and goodness will somehow endure. In the aftermath of battle, as the smoke cleared and the immediate threat receded into the distance, a profound stillness settled over the Alliance fleet that was different from the peaceful quiet that had marked the dawn. This was the silence that follows great events, heavy with the weight of what has been accomplished and lost, pregnant with the knowledge that nothing would ever be quite the same again for those who had witnessed and participated in these momentous hours. The ships moved slowly through water that still bore the debris of conflict, their crews working with methodical efficiency to clear away the evidence of battle while tending to the more important task of caring for their wounded comrades. There was no celebration, no cheering or triumphant shouts that might have marked the victory in other circumstances. The cost had been too high, the knowledge of what they had been forced to do too sobering for simple jubilation. On the flagship's quarterdeck, Admiral Proudmoore stood in contemplation, his weathered face reflecting the complex emotions that filled his heart as he watched his crews go about their grim duties. Victory had been achieved, but it had come at a price that would be counted not just in ships and lives, but in the innocence that could never be recovered. His sailors, who had begun this day as men who had never killed another human being, would return to port as veterans who carried the burden of necessary violence. The admiral's thoughts turned to the families who would receive word of this engagement in the days to come. Widows who would learn that their husbands would never return. Mothers who would discover that their sons had paid the ultimate price for freedom. Children who would grow up with only stories and memories to sustain them where living presence had once provided comfort and guidance. Yet he knew, with the certainty that comes from a lifetime of service to ideals larger than personal comfort, that this sacrifice had not been in vain. The enemy fleet had been turned back, their plans for easy conquest frustrated by the courage and skill of ordinary men who had risen to extraordinary heights when their world's survival depended on their actions. The innocent would sleep safely in their beds because professional warriors had been willing to sail into harm's way and face whatever dangers threatened the peaceful world they sought to preserve. Below decks, in the medical bays that had been transformed into scenes from a nightmare, the work of healing continued with the quiet dedication that marked the highest calling of human compassion. Dr. Mallory moved among his patients with gentle hands and kind words, his skills tested to their absolute limit by wounds unlike anything he had encountered in previous conflicts. The crude weapons of the enemy had inflicted damage that required new techniques and innovations in the ancient art of battlefield medicine. His assistant Sarah worked beside him with tireless devotion, her training in the cathedral hospitals proving invaluable as she applied her knowledge of anatomy and pharmacology to cases that would have challenged the most experienced surgeons. Her presence brought comfort to men who faced uncertain futures with injuries that would mark them for the rest of their lives. Her gentle touch and encouraging words providing hope in moments when despair seemed the only rational response to their circumstances. The ship's chaplain, Father Marcus, moved through the medical bay like an angel of mercy, offering the consolations of faith to those who sought them while respecting the beliefs, or lack thereof, of all who came under his care. He had performed the last rites for 17 souls during the course of the battle, men whose bodies would be committed to the sea that had been their life and would now be their eternal resting place. Each death had been a personal loss for the chaplain, who knew every member of his ship's crew by name and had counseled many of them through the personal struggles and spiritual crises that marked the human condition. Now he would be faced with the difficult task of writing letters to families who deserved to know how their loved ones had met their end, what final words they had spoken, what comfort he had been able to provide in their last moments. In the ship's workshop, old Henrik worked with his characteristic methodical precision to repair the damage that enemy fire had inflicted on the vessel's structure. Holes in the hull had been temporarily patched with canvas and tar, while more permanent repairs would have to wait until they could reach a proper shipyard with the materials and equipment necessary for complete restoration. The carpenter's practiced eye could already see the work that would need to be done. New timbers to replace those that had been shattered, new planking to cover the areas where enemy shot had torn through the ship's side, new rigging to replace the miles of rope and cable that had been cut by flying debris. It would be months before the ship was completely restored to her pre-battle condition, but she would sail again her scars serving as badges of honor that testified to the courage of her crew. The quartermaster, Thomas Blackwater, was conducting a careful inventory of the supplies that remained after the engagement, calculating how long the ship could remain at sea before needing to return to port for resupply. The battle had consumed enormous quantities of gunpowder and shot, while the medical supplies had been depleted far beyond what anyone had anticipated when they had first set sail from their home ports. His ledgers told a story of consumption and loss that went far beyond mere numbers, representing the transformation of peaceful materials into instruments of war and the conversion of human labor and ingenuity into the tools necessary for survival in a hostile world. Each entry in his careful handwriting marked another step away from the normal rhythms of civilian life and deeper into the harsh realities of military necessity. On the gun deck, Master Gunner Ironshot supervised the cleaning and maintenance of the great cannons that had served their crews so faithfully throughout the engagement. Each bronze barrel had to be carefully swabbed and inspected for signs of damage or wear that might affect their accuracy in future battles. The gun crews worked with the quiet pride of men who had proven themselves under the ultimate test, their weapons having spoken with voices of authority when the moment of truth had finally arrived. The cannons themselves seemed almost alive in the aftermath of battle, their bronze surfaces still warm from the heat of repeated firing, their carriages bearing the scars and stains that marked weapons that had been used for their intended purpose. Thunder's voice had cracked an enemy ship's mainmast with a perfectly placed shot, while Sea Dragon had hulled an orc vessel below the waterline, sending it to the bottom with all hands aboard. Throughout the fleet, similar scenes of damage assessment and repair were taking place as ships that had entered battle in pristine condition now bore the visible marks of their ordeal. The frigate Windchaser had lost her mizzen mast to an enemy catapult stone, while the great ship of the Line Sovereign's Pride bore dozens of scars along her hull, where enemy projectiles had tested the strength of her construction. Yet despite the damage they had sustained, the ships of the Alliance fleet remained fundamentally sound, their basic structure intact, and their crews still capable of performing their duties with the efficiency that marked professional military units. The enemy had been beaten back not through superior numbers or overwhelming firepower, but through the patient application of skill and training that had been developed over centuries of naval tradition. As the day advanced toward afternoon, the fleet began to reform its cruising formation for the continuation of their mission. The immediate threat had been dealt with, but intelligence reports suggested that this had been only the first wave of a much larger invasion force that would require continued vigilance and preparation. The victory they had won was significant, but it was also merely the opening move in a much larger game whose ultimate outcome remained very much in doubt. Signal flags flew between the ships as admirals and captains consulted their charts and planned their next moves based on the new intelligence that the battle had provided about enemy capabilities and intentions. The Orc fleet had been larger than expected, but less skillfully handled than feared, suggesting that while the invasion force was formidable in size, it might be vulnerable to the superior seamanship and training that the Alliance forces could bring to bear. The supply ships that had remained safely in the rear during the battle now moved forward to provide emergency assistance to vessels that had sustained damage or depleted their stores during the engagement. Fresh water and medical supplies were transferred to ships whose own supplies had been exhausted, while ammunition was distributed to replace what had been expended in the fighting. The hospital ship Mercy's Call, her white hull now stained with smoke and marked by the emergency repairs that had been necessary when enemy projectiles had tested her neutral status, continued her vital work of caring for the wounded from both sides. Dr. Eleanor Whitehaven and her staff had worked miracles of medical skill during the battle, saving lives that would have been lost under less expert care. Among the patients in her care were several orc warriors who had been pulled from the water when their ships had been sunk, men whose alien appearance could not disguise the fundamental humanity that marked all intelligent beings facing pain and uncertainty. The medical staff treated them with the same skill and compassion that they showed to their own wounded, for the laws of medicine recognized no distinction between friend and enemy when it came to the sacred duty of healing. The sun continued its arc across the sky, marking the passage of time with the same serene indifference that it had shown during the morning's violence. The light began to take on the golden quality that marked afternoon, transforming the scene once again into something that approached beauty, despite the evidence of recent conflict that still littered the water around them. Dolphins had returned to the area, their playful presence a reminder that life and joy would endure long after the causes of human conflict had been forgotten by history. They swam among the floating debris with apparent unconcern, their sleek forms cutting through water that had so recently been churned by the fury of battle. Their presence brought smiles to the faces of sailors who had seen too much death and destruction in the past few hours. Seabirds also returned to their feeding grounds, their cries once again providing a musical accompaniment to the eternal conversation between sea and sky. They showed no fear of the great ships that had so recently been belching fire and thunder, but instead seemed to welcome the new sources of food that the battle had provided in the form of scraps and refuse that inevitably followed any large-scale human activity. Young Turalian stood at the rail of his ship and watched the sun begin its descent toward the western horizon, his thoughts turning to the lessons that the day had taught him about the nature of leadership and the burden of command. He had led men into battle for the first time in his life and had seen some of them fall, had been forced to make decisions that determined who would live and who would die in the chaos of combat. The light still burned within him, perhaps even brighter now that it had been tested in the crucible of actual warfare and proven true under the ultimate test. But he understood now in a way that no amount of training could have taught him the awesome responsibility that came with the power to command other souls in battle. Every order he gave carried the potential for life or death. Every decision he made rippled outward to affect the fates of men who had placed their trust in his judgment. Around him, the crew went about their duties with the quiet efficiency that marked veterans who had proven themselves under fire. They moved differently now than they had in the morning, with the confident bearing of men who had faced the test of battle and emerged victorious. They had looked death in the face and had not flinched, had done their duty even when fear and uncertainty threatened to overwhelm their courage. But the cost of that transformation was written in their faces, in the haunted expressions of men who had been forced to do things that no civilized being should ever have to do, who had taken lives in defense of everything they held dear. They were heroes by any reasonable definition of the term, but they were also wounded souls who would carry the scars of this day for the rest of their lives. The wind had shifted as the day advanced, carrying new scents across the water that spoke of distant lands and unknown adventures that lay ahead. but it also carried the lingering traces of battle, smoke, and blood, and the acrid smell of gunpowder that would take days to completely disperse. The clean, salt air that had marked the morning was now tainted with reminders of what civilized beings could be forced to do when their survival was threatened. As evening approached, the fleet prepared for another night at sea, but this time with the knowledge that they had passed their first test and proven themselves worthy of the trust that their nations had placed in them. The watch schedules were adjusted to account for the wounded and the dead, while the surviving officers met to plan their strategy for the continuation of their mission. The enemy had been beaten back, but intelligence suggested that this had been only a probing attack, a reconnaissance in force designed to test the strength and resolve of the Alliance response. The main invasion fleet was still out there, somewhere beyond the horizon, gathering its strength for an assault that would dwarf today's engagement in both scale and ferocity. But for now, there was the immediate task of caring for their wounded and honoring their dead, of maintaining their ships and equipment in readiness for whatever challenges the future might bring. The first battle had been won, but the war was far from over, and the ultimate test of their courage and skill still lay ahead. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the water like scattered jewels. The beauty of the sunset served as a reminder that despite all the violence and destruction that human beings could visit upon each other, the fundamental beauty of creation remained unchanged and unchangeable. The crews of the Alliance ships paused in their labors to watch the sun sink toward the western horizon, its light transforming the scene into something that approached the sublime. Even men who had spent the day dealing with the harsh realities of war could not help but be moved by the magnificence of the natural world that surrounded and sustained them. As darkness began to fall once again over the waters of the Great Sea, the ships of the Alliance fleet settled into the routine of another night watch. But this time, they sailed not as untested crews facing an uncertain future, but as veterans who have proven themselves under the ultimate test and emerged victorious, though not unscathed. The stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky, their light reflecting off the water with the same ethereal beauty that had marked the previous night. But now their presence seemed less mysterious and more comforting, like old friends returning after a long absence to provide guidance and companionship to those who traveled the lonely paths of the sea. The night watches took their posts with the quiet confidence of men who had faced the ultimate test and had not been found wanting. They had stood their ground when the enemy came calling, had done their duty even when the cost was higher than anyone had anticipated. They were different men than they had been when the sun had risen that morning, marked by experiences that could never be undone or forgotten. But they were also stronger for having survived their ordeal, bound together by shared trials that had forged them into a brotherhood that would endure long after the specific details of their victory had faded from memory. They had looked into the abyss and had not blinked, had faced the darkness and had emerged with their humanity intact. And so, the tale continues, as all great tales must, with victory purchased at great cost, but won through courage and skill, and the willingness to sacrifice personal safety for the greater good. The first chapter in their story had been written in the morning's mist and sealed with the afternoon's blood, but the book remained open and the future unwritten. The scene fades slowly into peaceful darkness. carrying the listener gently toward dreams of distant seas, where heroes sail eternal watches under starlit skies, where courage and sacrifice are remembered and honored, and where the eternal struggle between light and darkness continues with the patience of the tides and the persistence of those who refuse to surrender their hope for a better world. In the quiet hours that followed, as the fleet settled into the rhythm of night, sailing once again, the stories of individual heroism and sacrifice began to emerge from the chaos of battle. Tales were whispered from watch to watch, passed along through the network of friendships and professional relationships that bound the crews together like an invisible web of shared experience and mutual respect. There was the story of Seaman Third Class, Robert Milhouse, barely 18 years old, who had remained at his post loading cannons even after a splinter from an enemy stone had opened a gash across his forehead that left him half blind with his own blood. He had continued his duties until the engagement was over, driven by loyalty to his gun crew and determination not to let his shipmates down in their moment of greatest need. Old Petty Officer McReady, a veteran of 20 years' service who had planned to retire after this voyage, had single-handedly fought off 3 orc boarders who had attempted to climb aboard his ship from a sinking enemy vessel. Armed with nothing but a boarding pike and his own fierce determination, he had held his section of the rail until marine reinforcements could arrive to drive off the assault. The ship's cook, Samuel, had turned his galley into an emergency aid station when the medical bay overflowed with casualties, using his knowledge of herbs and basic medical care to help stabilize wounded men until proper medical attention could be provided. His improvised treatments had saved at least 3 lives that might otherwise have been lost to shock and blood loss. Even Nelson, the ship's cat, had played his part in the day's drama, alerting the crew to a fire that had started in one of the lower compartments when an enemy incendiary projectile had penetrated the ship's hull. His frantic yowling had drawn attention to the danger in time for the damage control party to extinguish the blaze before it could spread to the magazine. These stories, and dozens of others like them, were the true currency of naval tradition, the informal history that bound generations of sailors together through shared values of courage, loyalty, and self-sacrifice. They would be told and retold in taverns and barracks for years to come, growing in the telling but never losing their essential truth about the nobility that ordinary people could display when circumstances called forth their finest qualities. The wounded were made as comfortable as possible in improvised sick bays throughout the fleet, their injuries tended by medical personnel who had learned their skills in the hard school of battlefield experience. Some would recover completely with time and proper care, while others would carry permanent reminders of this day for the rest of their lives. A few hung balanced on the knife edge between life and death, their fate dependent on the skill of their caregivers and the strength of their own will to survive. Dr. Mallory worked through the night without rest, moving from patient to patient with the methodical precision of a man who had long ago learned to compartmentalize his emotions in order to function effectively in crisis situations. Each case demanded his full attention and expertise. From simple wounds that required only cleaning and bandaging to complex injuries that pushed his surgical skills to their absolute limits. His assistant Sarah proved invaluable during those long hours, her training and natural compassion combining to provide exactly the kind of support that the situation demanded. She anticipated his needs before he could voice them, provided steady hands when delicate procedures required absolute precision and offered comfort to patients who faced uncertain futures with injuries that would mark them forever. The chaplain, Father Marcus, moved among the wounded like a guardian angel, offering whatever spiritual comfort his presence could provide to men facing pain and uncertainty far from the familiar surroundings of home and family. Some sought the formal consolations of religious ritual, while others simply needed someone to listen to their fears and acknowledge their suffering with compassionate understanding. He had already performed the last rites for 19 souls who had given their lives in defense of their homeland, men whose bodies would be committed to the sea that had been their life and would now serve as their eternal resting place. Each death had been a personal loss, for the chaplain made it his business to know every member of his ship's crew by name and to understand something of their individual struggles and hopes. Now he faced the difficult task of writing letters to families who deserved to know how their loved ones had met their end, what final words they had spoken, what comfort had been available to them in their last moments. It was perhaps the hardest part of his calling, trying to find words that could convey both the reality of loss and the meaning of sacrifice to people whose grief would make any explanation seem inadequate. As the night wore on, the fleet's formation gradually spread out across several miles of ocean, the individual ships maintaining contact through the careful use of signal lanterns that blinked coded messages across the dark water. The admiral had decided to disperse his forces, rather than present a concentrated target for any enemy vessels that might still be lurking in the area, while still maintaining sufficient coordination to respond rapidly to any new threats. The lookouts maintained their vigilant watch from their high perches in the rigging, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of danger that might be approaching under cover of darkness. They had been reinforced for the night watch, with additional seamen assigned to provide fresh eyes and ensure that fatigue did not compromise their ability to detect threats before they could develop into immediate dangers. The ship's armorer worked through the night, repairing weapons that had been damaged during the engagement, his forge glowing like a small star in the darkness as he shaped new parts and sharpened blades that would be needed if battle came again. The rhythmic hammering of his tools provided a musical counterpoint to the normal sounds of a ship at sea, a percussion section in the ongoing symphony of naval life. In the ammunition storage areas, careful inventories were conducted to determine exactly how much shot and powder remained after the day's expenditure. The numbers told a sobering story of consumption that would need to be taken into account when planning future operations. Naval battles were as much about logistics as they were about courage and skill, and commanders who ignored the mathematics of supply did so at their peril. The ship's carpenter and his mates continued their work of making permanent repairs to battle damage, their hammers and saws adding their voices to the nocturnal chorus as they shaped new timbers and fitted new planking to replace what had been destroyed by enemy action. Their work was lit by lanterns that cast dancing shadows across the damaged areas, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere as they performed their vital functions. On the quarterdeck, the officer of the watch maintained his lonely vigil, responsible for the safety of several hundred souls who slept in the compartments below. His eyes constantly moved between the compass and the horizon, monitoring wind direction and sea conditions while staying alert for any change that might signal approaching danger. The helmsman stood at the wheel with the patient concentration of a man whose small movements could mean the difference between safety and disaster for everyone aboard. His hands felt the ship's response to wind and wave through the vibrations that traveled up from the rudder, his experienced touch making constant minor adjustments that kept the vessel on course despite the unpredictable nature of wind and current. Below decks, off duty crew members tried to find rest in hammocks that swayed gently with the ship's motion, but sleep came hard to men whose minds were still processing the events of the day. Some stared at the overhead in the darkness, replaying moments of terror and triumph in an endless loop that would gradually fade with time, but never completely disappear from memory. Others wrote letters home by the light of carefully shielded candles, trying to find words that would convey something of their experiences without revealing details that might cause unnecessary worry. To loved ones who were already concerned about their safety, the letters spoke of homesickness and duty, of friendship forged in adversity and confidence that their cause was just and would ultimately prevail. The ship's stores were carefully rationed to ensure that supplies would last until they could reach a friendly port for resupply. Fresh water was particularly precious, with strict controls on consumption to prevent waste while ensuring that everyone's basic needs were met. The quartermaster's ledgers recorded every distribution with meticulous precision, for in the confined environment of a ship at sea, accurate accounting could literally mean the difference between life and death. In the magazine, special precautions were taken to ensure the safety of the remaining gunpowder, with guards posted around the clock and strict procedures followed for any access to the explosive materials. The powder boy, young Timothy, had been commended for his courage during the battle and promoted to full seaman's rating, a recognition that his bravery had earned him a place among the ship's trusted crew members. The galley continued to provide hot meals for the crew, though the menu was necessarily simple given the constraints of cooking at sea with limited supplies, and the cook took special care to prepare nourishing food for the wounded, understanding that proper nutrition was essential for healing and recovery from the trauma of battle. As the hours passed, the fleet gradually settled into the routine of night sailing, but with heightened awareness of the dangers that might be lurking beyond the circle of vision that surrounded each ship. The enemy had been beaten back, but intelligence suggested that this had been only a preliminary engagement, a reconnaissance in force designed to test the strength and disposition of the Alliance response. The main invasion fleet was still out there somewhere in the darkness, gathering its strength for an assault that would dwarf the day's battle in both scale and intensity. When that attack came, the Alliance forces would need to be ready with everything they had learned from this first encounter, applying the lessons purchased with blood to the greater test that lay ahead. But for now, in the quiet hours of the night watch, there was time for reflection and recovery, for tending to the wounded and honoring the dead, for the gradual processing of experiences that had fundamentally changed everyone who had participated in them. The battle was over, but its consequences would echo through the years to come, shaping the destiny of nations and the lives of countless individuals who would never know the names of those who had fought and died on this distant patch of ocean. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow comforting in their constancy. Sailors had navigated by those same stars for thousands of years, finding their way across trackless oceans by the light of celestial beacons that never failed in their duty. Tonight they seemed particularly bright, as if offering special protection to men who had proven themselves worthy of divine favor. The sea itself continued its ancient rhythm of wave and tide, washing away the debris of battle with the same patient persistence that had marked its nature since the world's beginning. By morning, little would remain to show where ships had fought and died, where men had displayed courage beyond the ordinary bounds of human behavior, where the fate of kingdoms had hung in the balance for a few crucial hours. But the memory would endure in the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed these events, carried forward into an uncertain future where their experiences would inform new decisions and shape new responses to whatever challenges might arise. They had looked into the face of war and had not flinched, had done what was necessary to protect the innocent and preserve the possibility of peace. And in that knowledge, as the night wore on and the stars continued their eternal watch over the sleeping sea, there was a kind of peace that surpassed mere absence of conflict. It was the peace that comes from duty faithfully performed, from courage proven under the ultimate test, from the knowledge that when the moment of testing had arrived, they had not been found wanting.